Again, for those of you who are just logging in, we're going to start properly in a couple of minutes' time. Welcome, and we'll be underway soon.
Hello to all those people who are commenting saying good morning too, by the way.
Yeah, morena. It's beautiful here in Tamaki Makaurau. I don't know how it is, what the weather's like elsewhere. It's a lovely day here.
That is a fantastic bookshelf too you've got there, Alison.
Oh, thank you. I was just saying to Jeremy and Simi, it's full of James Patterson because my partner is obsessed with crime novels. So I've tried to wedge a little Michael King in there just so that nobody judges me too harshly.
For a highbrow moment.
Yeah.
Well, they were talking about lesbian mysteries yesterday on the last panel, and that's intrigued me. I did not know that was a genre, but
neither.
I'm intrigued to explore.
Okay, I'm going to go back and watch that. That'll be my Christmas holiday reading sorted.
I don't know whether it means mysteries written by lesbians or whether it's, lesbians solving mysteries, or I don't know, but
hopefully both.
Anyway. Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully both.
I like a bit of Michael Connolly. Is there any there? Any of that?
Yeah, look. Oh my God.
That's my guilty pleasure.
There you go. There's a Michael Connolly for you. There's a bit of Ben Elton. Read the most fantastic Ben Elton novel at Christmas time. I think it's called Time After Time. Excellent read.
He's a pretty prolific writer, isn't he?
He's also, celebrity gossip, the nicest person, apart from Mandy Patinkin, who I just fell madly in love with. He is the nicest person I've ever interviewed.
It's always interesting when we get those little insights into, well-known people.
Yeah.
Like that sometimes that we don't necessarily print, but it's always interesting to see what people are like in real life.
Right, shall we make a start, team?
Yeah, sure.
So, thank you to everybody who's joined us. Kia ora, everyone. Ka mihi kia koutou. My name is Jeremy HANSEN, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of 2 to the power of 5, the power of queer words. This online forum is being run by the same but different LGBTQI+ Writers Festival. Now, our festival is normally held during Pride in February, but we're staging these special winter sessions thanks to the support of Creative New Zealand. Today, I want to welcome 2 very special guests. Felix DESMARAIS is a journalist for the Rotorua Daily Post, who's also written about his experiences as a trans man for the Spin-Off. And Alison MAU is a senior journalist and Me Too NZ editor at Stuff. We're here today to talk about the state of modern media and the spaces for queer voices within it. The last decade's seen massive shifts in the media with the collapse of old business models and media organisations, and a future that is deeply uncertain. That future can look bleak from some angles, but we want to talk about whether it also offers greater opportunity for queer voices to emerge and tell our stories. So welcome, Felix and Ali. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Kia ora.
Thanks for having us.
I wanted to start by asking you, Felix, given that we're talking about the way the media has changed and the collapse of the business models that have sustained it for such a long time, you only became a journalist a few years ago, and I wondered what on earth made you want to get into this very challenging industry.
Yeah, well, I was a playwright and comedian before I was a journalist, and I was kind of in a position where I was like, well, I'm kind of good at writing, maybe I should try and make some money out of that. So naturally I chose journalism, famously one of the most lucrative careers, not at all. So I thought I'd go and study communications at Massey, and I went and did that. And in the course of doing that, there was a course in journalism, and that was the bug that bit me. And then after that, I've just kind of been screwed, and this is my vocation now. I guess I just realized that it was the path for me, and so I kind of fell into it that way, I suppose.
And do you still have that feeling now that it's the path for you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's without getting too lofty about it, it's this enormous privilege of a job where you have these insights into people's lives, and people are extraordinarily generous with their stories, and I find that really humbling, and it makes me feel like I'm not just going to work every day to make a buck. I'm contributing, and contributing to society in some little way.
What about you, Ali? What made you want to be a journalist?
Well, first I'll say don't ever leave, Felix. We're glad you're with us. What made me want to be a journalist? I decided to be a journalist at the age of 12, and that is a very long time ago. My father was a journalist and my grandfather was a journalist. My grandfather was the editor of a newspaper in rural northern Victoria in Australia. And my father had been the shipping roundsman at the Melbourne Herald in the 1950s, when it was a very big deal because there were big, everything happened on the sea back then. So there was never really anything else for me, despite the fact that my favourite English teacher in year 11, I think it was, when I told her I wanted to be a journalist, she said, don't bother, you should go and be a teacher or a nurse like the other girls. Nothing against teachers and nurses at all. But back then it still wasn't something that even a student who was very, very good at English was shoulder tapped to do. So, yeah, and I just thought, oh, screw you. So, yeah, it's always, the only thing I've ever wanted to do.
I want to put this question to both of you, but perhaps you could tackle it first, Ali, and that is relating to the changes that we've seen in media lately and the difficulty that huge organisations have had internationally in working out a model that makes journalism pay. How does it feel to be working in that environment, and does it feel like a distraction from the very important work you're doing every day? And related to that, journalism is an important pillar of every democracy. So that's sort of feeling unstable at the same time. So I guess, let me summarize that. Are these difficult waters to navigate personally, given that there are kind of very real issues of job security for everybody that works in the media now?
Well, look, if you're asking personally, I suppose I feel more secure than I have at many other stages. I mean, remembering that I used to work in television and have been made redundant 4 times in my career. And when you work in television, as we've seen in the last week, you can be gone just like that for no reason, because that's what your contract states. So I know that my work is very highly valued where I work right now, and I believe in the ethics and the path that Stuff is on. So yeah, I feel kind of good about my position right now. But when you look more broadly, yes, it's things are in a parlous state, and I don't have the answer for that. I'll be really interested to see how Stuff's new approach, which is to focus on building trust with the reader, and asking for reader support at the same time. I'll be really interested to see how that goes. That is something that I love the idea of. But as you say, we're yet really to see, apart from some of the big international players, we're really yet to see any news organisation work out how to make money in this internet age, aren't we?
Felix, your role at the Rotorua Daily Post is in some ways an experiment to kind of retain that pillar of democracy aspect of journalism. Can you talk a little bit about the shape of your role and how it's funded and how that makes you feel working in that position?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a local democracy reporter, which was set up, I guess it was set up in the middle of last year, and sort of started getting going towards the end of last year, I think. And it's a scheme where the government has invested in journalism through New Zealand On Air. So there was money allocated in the budget to set up this local democracy reporting service, which put 8 reporters across the country in the regions. And it's specifically so that those reporters can cover local democracy. So that's the local councils, the regional councils, DHBs, that sort of thing, Māori trusts as well. And yeah, so I mean, it is a completely different way of funding journalism. Yeah, and so it works by, there are host newsrooms, and so for me, that's with NZME and at the Rotorua Daily Post. But all of our work goes into a portal and then is shared with all of the media partners. So my stories still end up in Stuff like they used to when I worked for Stuff, and RNZ and lots of other media partners too.
Is that a project that it sounds like it has great potential for expansion and for more reporters like you to be hired around the country? Is that the direction it's headed in?
Yeah, so I don't know too much about its expansion at this stage, but I do know that next year it will be 12 reporters, and the government did indicate sort of during the lockdown, I think, that they were going to expand it, and we weren't really sure to what extent they would do that, but I think the record of work of these 8 reporters that we've had shows, you know, the vitality of the service and what potential it has. Yeah, and so it looks like the government is investing and continuing that, which is pretty cool.
You've written on the spin-off about your experiences of transitioning, and you're now working in, you know, a relatively small city in New Zealand, and in a newsroom covering local democracy. And I wondered if you'd found any challenges in terms of feeling comfortable and accepted in that, you know, working outside a main centre, and whether that impacts at all the way your journalistic subjects might regard you. How does that all play out for you?
Yeah, well, I've kind of had dual experiences with that, because in Rotorua, I'm not actually entirely sure how many people know that I am trans, because I do have passing privilege most of the time. And so I'm not even entirely sure how many of my colleagues know, let alone the people that I work with when I'm doing my stories. So in that way, in Rotorua, I've been treated as a man and as cisgender and with all of that passing privilege. So, I mean, it's always a consideration of mine that maybe if people are really bigoted, that they won't speak to me, and that sort of just, I mean, as a person, that might hurt, but I'm actually more concerned about, as a journalist, not being able to have access to sources if they won't talk to me because they don't like trans people or whatever. But then conversely, at Stuff, I think possibly maybe Stuff journalists are just more gossipy, or I don't know. Maybe you can speak to that, Ellie. I don't know. But it seemed like everybody sort of knew when I started, more or less. So I was always very, you know, it was an open thing in the newsroom, and it's not a secret anyway. So yeah, I guess my experience at the moment is my transness doesn't sort of precede me, and it doesn't, I think even if people did know or do know, they don't need to impact the way that they deal with me as a person or as a journalist.
Trans rights, of course, have become this kind of very high-profile contested space because of the opposition of some very high-profile figures or the controversial opinions of them. And I wondered if you felt compelled as a trans person to kind of tackle those issues in your work, and if you were to do so, how you would feel about doing that.
I'm compelled in my work to raise the voices of people who are often unheard, and it so happens that at the moment some of those voices are trans and non-binary voices. So to me, it's really just an insight. Being trans myself and being involved in the community, the queer community, I have a bit of an insight into what's going on in those communities, and so in that way I'm aware of potential stories. But yeah, I don't feel a need to prioritize trans or non-binary stories. But yeah, as I say, it's you know, everybody has their own ins in certain areas. You know, I was also a comedian, so I know what's going on in the comedy scene, you know, so everybody has their little ins in certain areas, and so they know what's going on, and that might influence what stories they do.
Ali, I wanted to talk to you about an experience you had with media a decade ago, because you've been a television journalist and a presenter, you're also a kind of public figure in a sense. And I wondered if you were happy to talk about the kind of outing that you experienced a decade ago, and whether you thought that kind of behaviour from the media would occur now, a decade on.
I've thought a lot about this. So for those who don't know, in February 2010, around my birthday actually, I was publicly outed on the cover of Women's Day and on the front page of the Herald on Sunday. I think it might have been the weekend before, so early February. That followed a month or so. I'm trying to remember exact timings, where myself and my partner and my family had been stalked and photographed, papped, they call it. Yeah, what can I say? It was a terrible time. I cried a lot, and I look back on it, and others look back on it with very different eyes now. So almost everybody involved, all of the journalists, and even the commissioning editor, for example, of the Herald on Sunday, Shane Curry, I've been in touch with, and they all have apologised over the years for their part in it. You know, Caroline Mengye came to my house, asking me questions about my relationship in front of my children, who were very young at the time. I almost ran her over. It was a very tough, awful time. And I don't know whether I really even realised why in the moment. Of course, I then thought a lot about it and realised that best practice for queer people is to be able to own and manage and choose your time of coming out. That's your thing. That's not anybody else's thing. And I think that probably was the most outrageous thing about it. At the time, interestingly, I tried to get some physical evidence for you to look at, right? I went to go into all the libraries. The Women's Day from that era no longer exists. The best I could come up with, I went to the library and I had to use the microfiche. For God's sake. This was an article that was written by the Herald on Sunday's Matt Nippert the week after the outing. And it attempts, I guess, to be nice, contextualise, I would say, excuse their behaviour. I've spoken to Matt, the journalist, who's I don't know, presumably everybody knows the name Matt Nippert. He's an amazing journalist and a nice guy. He has since apologised for this, by the way, and has told me that he felt very uncomfortable about it at the time. The commissioning editor was Shane Curry, and he is adamant that things would be very different these days. So I think things have changed. The only person I never got an apology from was the editor of the Women's Day, and Bauer Media over the years have continued to kind of castigate me about it as if it was my fault. So that's a bit of a shame. But to answer your question, yeah, I do think things have changed, and I don't think that would be handled the same way these days. However, the other day I sent you guys a link to a Daily Beast story where as recently as 2016, a reporter in the Olympic Village in Rio decided it would be a great laugh and a great basis for a story to connect with people who are also in the village, athletes, on Grindr, and out them on the website. So, things have changed and things haven't changed, I guess. I feel like New Zealand's moved on, which is great. Reading this brought it all back for me. I had a really anxious day or few moments when I read that. But I'm pleased to know that the people involved, would probably act differently. Also, completely different environment. So this happened back when Rachel Glusina and the other gossip columnist, I forget her name, were kind of going ding dong head to head every weekend to try and get the juiciest gossip in New Zealand, where almost nothing ever happens. So the landscape's a bit different as well.
Yeah, what do you think has changed? Like, are you saying that maybe we've become a kinder and more understanding society, or that the media's shifted in a sense that means the pursuit of those kinds of stories that have that sort of salacious, gossipy item to them aren't prized in the same way?
Probably both. I think there is an understanding, I don't know whether you agree, Felix, but I think there is an understanding that, that this is not gossip, it's people's lives, it's people's legitimate lives. There is no, there's certainly no shame in or approbation attached to the kind of relationship I have, or, I mean, there still is in some sectors, and I frequently get lovely emails from people, which I delete immediately. But I think there's a greater understanding of I don't know how to describe it, just the humanity of the situation, and that it's not, it's also important for the people involved to be able to control their narrative. I think that's what it comes down to. Back when this happened to me, nobody seemed to care or understand that it was wrong to publicly out somebody and, take away their choice and their voice like that. So,
what I'm kind of curious about is, sorry to cut you off, Ellie.
No worries.
Is, to me, sometimes being transgender is like the new gay. It's kind of like right now where transgender rights are in this country and the way that people think about trans people seems to me very similar to the way that we used to talk about gay people about 10 to 15 years ago, which gives me hope, right? That means that we are going to progress with trans rights as well. But I wonder if there was a television journalist today who passed and then could be outed as trans in the same way, as a hypothetical. What do you think?
That is such a great question. I know that there would be, maybe it's about the people who work in the newsrooms that are making those choices. For example, if that story came across my desk or my news director's desk, I would be fighting tooth and nail for them to tie hoa on it and have a good think about the implications. And as a senior journalist, I feel comfortable in doing that. I work the same way with issues of sexual violence. If we're reporting a story and there are problematic elements to it, in the body of the story or the headline, I'm fine with speaking up, and I'm confident my voice will be taken into consideration. So, but I agree with you. I can't say it wouldn't, be a story that would be pursued by some newsrooms, which is terrible, isn't it? I agree with you that the glacial pace of change is yet to catch up with the issue of trans rights. So, and that scenario that you've just explained just chills me. I hope we don't ever see that.
Well, sometimes it crosses my mind because I am interested in doing television journalism one day, and I'm out obviously, so it wouldn't really be possible for me to be outed as such. But I do wonder how much of a big deal it would be. I did have one TV journalist who I spoke to once say, "Oh, you should be a journalist on TV because we don't have any." And I kind of thought, well, I actually want to be a journalist on TV because I'm good at that job, not because I'm New Zealand's first out trans person on TV,
And that is an issue, because I was just about to say, if there was an out trans television presenter, how powerful would that be for young trans people? But you don't want to be there just for that, absolutely. You want to be there because you're good, and you want to be there because you're, promoted into that very prized position. I mean, this is the thing with television presenting. You are kept in line by the intrinsic and explicit, i.e. you're reminded all the time, knowledge that you could be replaced in a heartbeat. That's how they keep you in line, so that you don't ask for anything. So of course you want to be there for your talents. But isn't that the issue with representation right across the board? I mean, it's the same with the hoary old argument of getting more women and people of colour and queer people on boards of management, in those governance positions. You don't want to be the only woman on a board because your voice is completely subsumed, but you don't want to you feel that you're there just as the token. So this is something I think we're all still grappling with, aren't we?
Do you think the advent of social media has taken the heat out of some of the issues you're discussing because it allows people the possibility of being in more control of their own narratives? When you were talking about what happened to you, that was a currency that the media controlled, and you wouldn't have had the same platform to be able to say, here's my situation, I will comment no further. Yeah,
absolutely. So by kind of 2011, 2012, I was on Twitter, and when New Idea came out with, ripped some pictures off my Facebook page and came out with a front page story about Carleen and I getting engaged, which was a completely made up story. I was able to put that on Twitter and say, don't read this shit. This is untrue. I've actually got the magazine in the other room. I can show it to you if you like. But incredibly powerful to be able to do that. I mean, back when the magazines were ringing me up and saying, can you please comment on, the fact that we know you're gay? The only way to control it was to tell them that I would only comment if they agreed to print my comment in entirety. And I kept it short because I knew that that was the only way that I would get my actual voice out. Because otherwise, what happens? My comment would be chopped up into little bits and, and not changed, but brought into the story in a non-complete way. Social media, absolute revolution.
And then, so it didn't you sort of give a bit of a reply on air one day as well?
Oh yeah, and it made was it the top 50?
That was a story in itself, wasn't it?
Top 100 New Zealand television moments of the last 50 years or something. Yeah, so it happened in a funny old way. Have we got time to talk about this, Jeremy? Because it's it's a bit of a tangent, but it's slightly interesting. So the magazine and the newspaper came out on the Sunday and Monday morning, and as it happened, I was hosting breakfast at the time on TVNZ, and as it happened, on a Tuesday morning, we always had a What's in the Women's Magazine segment. So, I know. So on the Tuesday morning, I went to my executive producer and I said, look, I want to do something a little bit different today, if you don't mind. And I showed him what I wanted to say, and he had a good look at it, and he took some of the worst stuff out. And then he said, okay, you're good to go. And so, I had, the first time I've ever had a proper rant. I'm using that word rant. I've looked back at it, and I'm actually, it wasn't hysterical. It was quite calm and controlled, actually, but it did make very clear what the damage to my family had been, and what the last, few weeks had been like for us. The fuss after that, the approbation that I'd actually, used some space on state-sponsored television to tell people how I felt was massive. But as always happens, it's, a year or 2 years later, people were looking back at it and saying, wow, go girl, good for you. So, passage of time and all that. I've never regretted it. I never once regretted that. I felt like it was a moment of taking control, and that was certainly really important for me. So
kind of maybe reset the equilibrium using the media itself. Again,
Well, I had a platform. Fortunately, I never would have just gone rogue and done it without permission. That's what everybody seemed to think, that I just suddenly something snapped in my head and I started to pay out on people. No, it was a script, and it was pre-approved by my executive producer, and the only person I felt sorry for that day was poor Pippa Wetzel, because she had to sit there, incredibly uncomfortable moment for her, right? If you look, you can Google this, if you're watching, you can Google this this moment on Breakfast TV, and I did look back at it and feel a bit sorry for Pippa, who I loved, because what was she going to say? but yeah, it was quite satisfying. What can I say?
It leads me to a question, Ali, for both of you, about, you mentioned before representation on boards and things like that, and there is the stereotype of the media previously being kind of smoke-filled newsrooms that are completely dominated by white men and their banter. Do you think the media is now doing a better job in this time of upheaval of presenting a broader range of voices and perspectives than it did before?
Yes, but sometimes you really still have to push for it. A good story is a good story, and those will always run. But we need to do better at making sure representation, we get representation from a broader spread of people in our stories. And you have to do that mindfully, right? So when I'm writing a story, and the example I'm going to use is an examination of the criminal justice system I did a year or so ago, from the point of view of survivors of sexual violence, and I deliberately looked for this is just one example, but I deliberately went looking for a Māori wahine criminal barrister. And you have to be that deliberate, because, the voices that we go back to again and again are, because society, generally by default, white men. So sometimes you have to be really deliberate about, finding other voices, and there will be there's failings that I've made when you're rushing to get a story up, and you're once again featuring those default voices. We could all do better, not only with people of colour but other marginalised voices as well. There are wonderful, knowledgeable queer people in our university systems who are terrific spokespeople in their specialist subject, but you need to be mindful about seeking those out. So yeah, I think there's more to do. Does that answer your question? I kind of lost the thread there.
From your perspective too, Felix.
Yeah, I think well, within newsrooms, getting the diversity in there in the first place, I think a big thing about that is that those workplaces need to be actively welcoming to marginalised or minority people. So we don't have a lot of Māori journalists coming through. We don't have a lot of trans journalists coming through, and other groups like that. And that's, I think, a lot to do with that those workplaces often don't seem very welcoming. And I don't mean necessarily, they have a big welcoming ceremony when you walk in the door. But, you know, little things like for trans people, like, well, put it this way, I think one non-binary journalist, and I often think about when I'm at, you know, the various workplaces that I've been at in my relatively limited career, there haven't been gender-neutral bathrooms. And just little things like that. It's like, how can a person want to work at an organisation where, you know, there's a male and a female toilet, and maybe they don't feel like that is the right toilet for them. If they can't just go to the toilet in peace, you know, are they going to want to be journalists at all? And so to help raise the voices of those people in our work, we also need to have those people in our newsrooms and influencing our editorial practices. So I think it really starts at that foundation level, that these spaces need to be welcoming to minorities.
There's also this concept that, you know, overrides or is a kind of governing principle of journalism, the concept of objectivity. And there's been a lot written about that, well, forever, I suppose, but that the supposed objectivity tends to be the perspective of a straight white male. And I wondered how you both wrestle with this concept in your work. And because you've both written opinion pieces as well, what's the right amount of yourselves to have in a story?
Oh, all of it. I'm like all in. I always, that kind of comes from my television background, because, you know, when you're a host of, not the 6 o'clock news, but when you're a host of something like the breakfast program, you need to accept early on that you're not going to be any good at it unless you're prepared to make a real dick of yourself. You know, pardon the language. So, and when I first, but it's a bit of a journey. So when I first started writing opinion pieces, which is probably as far back as kind of 2013, I was a bit more reticent. But my only kind of lines now are when I'm talking about other people. So for example, I always get the permission of my children or my partner before I talk about them or about issues that affect them. I'm not so careful with my mum and dad though. they're in Australia, so they still read the stuff though. But I've been like that with social media as well. I never post pictures of my children. I never have posted pictures of my children without asking their permission, even when they were younger. I really struggle with this, you know, put your family out on Instagram every moment of the day, because that stuff lives forever, and you don't know how that young person who can't give their permission is going to feel about it. That's a bit of a tangent, but to answer your question, I'm like to think of myself as a pretty open book. So yeah, I'm happy with almost anything. Yeah.
How about you?
I'm a little more hesitant, and I think it's got a fair bit to do with the fact that I'm a more junior journalist. I think there are some things that shouldn't be up for debate, that aren't necessarily opinions, and you know, those are, you know, human rights. So I haven't written a lot of opinion pieces, and the one that I have, I think, was about trans rights, but I can't remember exactly what it was about it, but it was basically just about trans people's right to exist. So yeah, and in terms of putting myself in stories, I've done it maybe twice. One for a mental health story that I did, where I thought it would strengthen the story, because it was all about how to help a friend in a mental health crisis, and I've been in that place, and so it would seem wrong for me to write that story and not declare that I'd been in that place and I know how it feels. And another time when I was doing a profile on a trans woman, and kind of comparing her experience to mine because I'm a little bit older than her. So yeah, for me, in my work, and because I'm doing it often a different kind of journalism to Ellie, it's I think you probably agree, Ellie, yours is more long form and it's longer investigations, that sort of thing, whereas mine's a daily churn out of, churn is probably a bit unfair, but of, council meetings and things like that. So my voice in that, I feel very strongly, shouldn't be there. I mean, obviously, I'm this conduit, and there's parts of me in the way that I write things that are left on the page. But yeah, I tend to, at this stage in my career at least, take a pretty hands-off approach. But when it does come to things that relate to human rights, racism, that sort of thing, I don't think that that's an opinion to believe that human beings are human beings.
This is a question that's come through on the Q&A section of the site from Emma. And it's a kind of journalistic principle that's also been closely examined in the last few years, but without kind of clear answers yet. And that's the need for so-called balance, which sometimes involves, when you're talking about trans rights, for example, very fringe groups getting equal billing in a story to somebody who might make a lot more sense. And it's also happened in issues like climate change, for example, where climate change deniers are kind of given the same amount of media airspace to promulgate their views as people who are, on the side of 98% of scientists. So how do you both weigh up those things? Because that kind of conventional talk about the other side in journalism can often be not only not balanced, but also quite damaging to some of the people who might read that content.
Yeah, that's also, I'll point out, happening in the legalised cannabis debate, and it is really, really worrying. That is the big debate in journalism at the moment, I think. I'm a little bit, I don't know whether protected is the right word, but having set up the hashtag MeTooNZ project, I've kind of got my stake quite firmly in the ground. That what I do is advocacy, investigative journalism, and I'm quite open about that. That's not to say my investigations don't have to be scrupulously fair and incredibly intricately reported, because otherwise we'd never get them over the line with our lawyers. So, but people know how I think about sexual harassment. I think I've been pretty clear about that. But the big debate in journalism now is how we manage that growing knowledge that that it's not an equal, one side versus the other side, when one of the sides is peddling absolute crap. You can't give equal weight to opinions that are not based on as Felix said, on science and on decency, human decency, on human rights. That's an absurdity. But for so many years, decades, centuries, we have had this rule in journalism where you give, equal, sometimes an equal amount of paragraphs to each side, and you don't put much effort into contextualizing that. To me, it's all about the context these days. And I guess, as a senior journalist, I'm given a lot more space to manage that myself. I think it must be really hard for younger and less experienced journalists. And I'm not talking about you, Felix, because I count you as quite experienced. But, for people who are just starting out, that must be really super difficult, because you're still, I'm assuming, taught in journalism school about, being fair. So that debate, I think, is in its infancy. I see trans rights as being a big driver of that debate, actually, along with, as you said, climate change and other issues. And I think it's early days, but it's, it's going to be it's going to be thrashed out continuously, I think, if that makes sense.
Well, it's also our job as professionals, you know, it's what we've been taught to do, is to assess sources and their authority. You know, if they're saying one thing and doing another, you know, if maybe one group says, I'm not transphobic, and then they're out beating up trans people, for example, for a crude sort of example, then obviously we're going to, as journalists, you know, think, well, they're hypocrites. They're not walking the talk. So therefore, what we deprioritize them in terms of them being a credible source. We're less likely to include them because, because they're not such a good source, and that's what our job is to do, is to make that assessment so that the reflection of what is going on is fair.
Sometimes often one side of the argument simply deserves more weight. You know, whatever criticism you might get for that, you know, as you say, it is impossible to with good conscience and using your intellect, give as much weight to some arguments as opposed to others.
I have hope for that as well in where journalism is at now and where it's going in the future, and that I feel like journalism has actually got smarter with that. I think that maybe, and I might be being unfair to my four people, but in journalism, but I feel like in the past it was a kind of paint by numbers. It's like, oh, well, here's this person saying, maybe let's look at like civil unions and the backlash against that, or homosexual law reform even. You know, there were groups that were saying, oh, well, of course gay people shouldn't have the right to be gay. And so you then turn around and go to the other side, and the other side is saying that they do. Maybe that was a poor example, but kind of, you know, it was very much like, oh, here's one side, now let's get somebody who disagrees. And we know now, I think, better, journalists know better, that that's not necessarily fair.
And it's not just journalism that does that. Remember, that crazy idea was the genesis of the referendum on same-sex marriage in Australia, which, you know, rained down all sorts of harm on queer people, you know, just for the sake of confirming what they already knew from multiple, you know, countrywide surveys. So, yeah, I mean, other parts of society, politicians in this case, do it as well, I guess.
Does social media mean now that journalism feels more contested or more conversational, and that you're able to put stories out in the world and people are able to, you know, respond directly to you on whatever channels you might be on, or share that information and try and shout it down? How do you manage the kind of impacts of your stories? Because the days are well gone where you could kind of issue something in the newspaper and that was the word, and the response could come through letters to the editor. Now it's happening in real time and is often potentially harmful, the conversation that happens later.
Yeah, it's a good point. Block. block. No, I'm concerned by what I see on social media, and maybe it's just the people I follow, but the amount of oh God, what's the word? The amount of negative feeling towards journalism on social media, journalism as a whole, is worrying. And we all get, you know, I think that's because there is so much content cycling through. You know, you look at a website like Stuff, sometimes you can publish great story on stuff, and because there's so much content coming at the website, it's there for 5 minutes and then drops from view altogether, and you have to search for it if you ever want to find it again. And I think that is driving this sense that, oh, it's all rubbish. It's not all rubbish. We have some fantastic journalism in this country. We have journalists who are regularly breaking stories that the public urgently need to know about and wouldn't hear about without those journalists doing that work. So I am, when people say, oh, we've got no good journalists in this country, it's all rubbish, that really concerns me, and it makes me wonder, really how those people that say that are consuming their news, are they actually looking for good content?
I found it really hard not to get really worked up by that, because I think it's so unfair, because our media is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I really do believe we do have one of the best media, best batch of journalists in the world, in the Western world at least. So
I spend a lot of time because normally if they're going to come for me, they're going to come for me on issues of sexual harassment, and I'm constantly accused of being biased, politically biased in that space. And so I spend a lot of time copying and pasting links from my previous stories to refute that. And they never apologise. No, sometimes they do. But I think it's, people who come at me and say, why you're so biased, why haven't you ever written anything about sexual harassment in the Labour Party? And I'm like, I then copy and paste 8 links to stories that I've written. Obviously those people miss that. They haven't bothered to go and search that and find that before they attack me. So it's fairly easy to say, well, you don't even need to shoot them down. You just say, here you go, I've done your work for you, you lazy ass. So yeah, I mean, social media is wonderful and incredibly problematic all at the same time, isn't it?
Well, we live in an era of probably the biggest era ever of disinformation and the circulation of false information, as well as a lot of groups who are pushing particular agendas who are great at dog whistling. And so I guess this is, since we're kind of getting shorter on time, I wonder if this would be a good opportunity for you both to reflect on the media's role in a time of disinformation and how fundamental your jobs are, but also where you see things going in 8 or 10 years' time.
Well, I just think we're getting increasingly more important, even as the trust in the media does seem to be eroding. And yeah, I don't know what the fix is for that. Sometimes I think journalism needs better PR, but that might be a little bit of a clash. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is.
Don't feel bad. I don't think anybody can answer that question right now. Who knows? I think there's some really interesting things being done in that space. For example, the decision by Stuff to stop engaging with Facebook altogether. That was a massive decision a couple of weeks ago. And it was done because Sinead and the rest of the management team have made a decision that Facebook is, they can see that Facebook is driving a ton of misinformation, and they no longer, and not doing anything about it, and they no longer want to support that platform. It's all very well for an organisation or, a platform like Stuff to make that decision, because we get so much of our traffic, unique visitors who, come straight to the site for their news. So, and we still don't know how getting off Facebook will affect numbers. but it's a, you know, it's a bold move, and it's been done to try and mitigate the incredible like flood of misinformation that flows through social media. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on. I honestly don't know. You know, I hope I'm still in the business in 10 years. I'll be almost at retirement age. But my partner says I'll never stop working anyway, so that's okay. But I have no idea what it's going to look like. I said to Sam Hayes when she, you know who I mean by Sam Hayes, of course, everybody knows Sam Hayes. I said to her when she was announced as the new 6 o'clock newsreader at TV3 when Hilary Barry left, I congratulated her. We were having a little chat in the kitchen, and I said, you know, you might be the last one. And she sort of looked at me, and I went, oh, no, I didn't mean anything bad by that. But, you know, your legacy might be that you were the last person to sit in that chair, you know, such as the change in the way we consume news, that, you know, the 6 o'clock news, I don't even watch 6 o'clock news anymore. And I'm a news junkie because I've seen everything. You know, sometimes I tune in to see the analysis from you know, their political journalists, but usually I'm you know, I'm full up to here with the news because there are so many other ways to consume it. You know, things are changing so rapidly that I you know, can't even begin to answer your question, Jeremy.
I really do hope by, you know, 8 to 10 years time, we've shifted public thinking around paying for the news as well, because it costs money to make journalism. And even if you're consuming stuff from RNZ, you're still paying for it. People seem to forget that. They go, oh, go to RNZ, it's free, or read an LDR story, it's free. Well, you've paid for it. And rightly so, because it does cost money to make. So, I mean, I don't know if it's even possible because we might have bottled it by making it free for so long. But I do hope that the value of proper, verified, impartial news is seen more, and that people will pay for it because it's the only way. It's the only way for it to survive.
Every news management team in the world wishes they had a wee time machine that they could jump into and go back 15 years and make everybody pay for websites at that point, because we wouldn't be in the position we are now.
Yeah. I just don't understand. You know, sometimes it comes from older people as well. They say, oh, this is outrageous. Why should we pay for premium on New Zealand Herald? It's like, well, you were paying for the paper before.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so.
So weird, and nobody's managed to come up with an answer for that. For a while, it was going to be video on news websites was going to be the great saviour, and that didn't work either. You know, or the international companies that invested heavily in video units. You know, it's still an income generator, but it's not the great saviour that it was supposed to be either. So, who knows? That's above my pay grade, Jeremy.
We've just come up to 12 o'clock, so I think we should wrap things up there. So I wanted to say thank you, of course, to Creative New Zealand for supporting these sessions, and thank you to everybody who tuned in with us. This will be available, keep an eye on the same at different websites, because this session will be available to review later on. There's Ali's pet. But mostly I wanted to thank you, Ali and Felix, for your thoughtfulness and your insights today. It's been really great talking to you, and I think everybody's really enjoyed the experience.
Loved it. Thank you. Oh, look, Ricky.
I got one too.
What's his or her name?
Oh, this is Jed.
Hi, Jed.
Who's that?
That's Frankie.
Frankie, gorgeous.
She is gorgeous.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Really lovely to talk to you today. Thanks for listening.
Yeah,
bye-bye.